One of the big differences that you're going to see in the executive order is that it's going to be responsive to the judicial ruling, which didn't exist previously. And so those are mostly minor technical differences. Fundamentally, you're still going to have the same basic policy outcome for the country. Those basic policies are still going to be in effect.
Again, that's senior White House advisor Stephen Miller, the same guy who said that we're not allowed to question anything. Anyway, he's talking now about the new travel ban the administration will release by the end of this week. Now, reports are saying the same 7 Muslim-majority nations will be the ones directly impacted. You'll remember that the last ban was overturned by the courts. Now, here's part of that Ninth Circuit Court's ruling. Quote, the executive order violates the Establishment and Equal Protection Clauses because it was intended to disfavor Muslims. The states have offered evidence of numerous statements by the president about his intent to implement a Muslim ban. Now, I guess those judges heard candidate Trump say things like this on the campaign trail.
Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until our country's representatives can figure out what the hell is going on.
Well, with his own words, then you also supplement that with what Rudy Giuliani, who was impaneled, if you will, by our now president in the transition. Rudy Giuliani went on camera and said, hey, yeah, the new president, he asked me to write up something so that I'd basically put in a Muslim ban here for these specific nations. Now, it's been rewritten, Mayo, and apparently some of the stuff is released to green cards and visas. They've cleaned that up. But it seems to me that the overarching question is still going to be, did you just put lipstick on a pig, in effect, which is, at the end of it, was the motive? And that seems, and you guys tell me if I'm wrong, that the overarching question is, what is your motive here? You still are using these 7 countries, and more than that, your own words said your stated goal of this was you wanted to keep Muslims out. Do I have it right?
Absolutely. And you start to look at the Establishment Clause, and it seems to favor Christians that are coming from Syria.
Explain the Establishment Clause to the audience who's not familiar.
That the government is not to establish or favor one religion over another. And here we're singling out Muslims. We're singling out Muslim-majority nations. We're ignoring other Muslim-majority nations where arguably people have actually attacked the United States as well.
Why can't the administration and the new president say, time out a second, Mayo, I'm just using the guidelines set by the last administration. They identified these 7 nations as nations that either harbored or at least were sources of terroristic people and threats to the national security. I'm just taking what they did and I'm just taking it one step further.
Well, you can argue that, and as you know, I often go back, and it doesn't matter what administration it is. Quite often, presidential administrations, regardless of party, implement acts that are unconstitutional, and I would suggest that the previous act was equally unconstitutional. It wasn't implemented in the same way, but it was unconstitutional in the way that it targeted certain nations, and in particular, a vast majority of individuals. And in terms of the states even, you have individuals who live in the United States, and if you happen to have family members who come from that country, now you're going to be deprived of the ability to have them come and visit, where someone else may freely have their family members come and visit.
Bill, can you unring a bell? If you said it as a candidate, can you say I didn't really mean it? This is something completely different. It's there in Technicolor.
You know, the thing that is so alarming, if you will, is the fact that he has yet to walk back what he said. Now, if he wants to rewrite this ban,
right?
What he really needs to do, if he took the time to read the Ninth Circuit decision, or if or the people under him took the time to do that as advisors, they would recognize that he has a heavy burden now of walking that back, because if he doesn't do that, and he hasn't, those same statements are going to come back to haunt him. And I think that, you know, I go back to what he said. The other thing also is, look, he has not won any favor with the judiciary. You don't refer to judges as so-called judges, you know, and then expect that when you appear before them, they're going to look with favor upon you. You know, they're going to be looking for any reason to look with disfavor upon you. So it seems to me that when the Ninth Circuit came down with his decision and his response was, see you in court, he never went that extra step, because I think those closest to him advised him that the Supreme Court was not likely to overturn the Ninth Circuit.
Now, Bill, he had a lot of different options, he and his Justice Department, that they could have gone in. They could have chosen to rewrite it.
Right.
They could have gone the legislative route. They
Right.
could have chosen to go to another. In your eyes, from a strategic standpoint, did they pick the path of least resistance, or did they make it harder for themselves?
Well, you know, he has the power as the president to issue any executive order he wants. He doesn't have to depend upon the legislature to legislate. So presidents write executive orders all the time, which are not challenged congressionally or judicially. In this case...
But if it was Congress, it wouldn't be about, I mean, it's always about him, but it wouldn't be about him. It would have been about a piece of legislation, and he wouldn't have to basically argue with his own words.
Yeah, and I think what was in his mind was, I think that it was an insecurity as to whether or not he was going to be able to get any bill passed through the Congress, even though it was Republican controlled, and he basically took the easy way out by writing an executive order, and he's trying to write it in a way that's going to pass judicial muster. I don't think this is going to do that, but of course we haven't seen it yet.
Yep.
He is picking the path of least resistance and the most expedient way to do it. If you pass legislation, the legislation gets challenged, then you're going through the court system and you're there for longer than this process. By rewriting it, he's going to say the magic words. He is going to differentiate between people that do have rights, the green card holders and others. He's going to differentiate between the green card holders and those that have no rights. That's what he's going to do. He's going to rewrite
But
it.
how does he get around the one part, unless you think he doesn't need to, which is he stated what his mission was before he ever did this executive order. The Ninth Circuit referenced that as well. They said, this is what you intended to do, and you accomplished it with this executive order. Does he need to say, I'm not targeting this population? Does that matter?
I think he needs to walk it back, as Bill said. I think he needs to walk it back in the executive order. I think he needs to distinguish between those that have rights and those that don't have rights. I think he needs to put a mission statement in there that is very clear, that is at least on its face not violative of the Establishment Clause.
And also, I'm sorry to interject, but and also he just needs to, I really think his administration needs to just familiarize themselves with the robust screening apparatus that's already in place within the Department of Homeland Security. I mean, we've had it 15 years since 9/11 of legislation improving screening, improving security measures.
Well, I've had people on the front lines explain that process.
And
but to me, the one confusion I always had was, in this 2.0 version, why did he keep Iraq in there? Because all those interpreters are still subject to being barred now because they don't have green card status or visa status as well. I had heard, well, oh my God, and that was where the military got their shackles up, which was, time out, these are the guys who literally fought on the front lines. They never made that clarification in this new version.
We're operating under the belief that he really wants to have this passed, because if it fails again, he can turn to his perceived base and say, look, I tried.
I think he does now.
Well,
he doesn't. Anytime there's an L for a loss next to anything he does, we know you're going to get a tweet at 2 in the morning.
To Jim's point, though, and this is interesting, we're talking about what Trump said. You touched upon it briefly before. Look at what Rudy Giuliani said.
Yeah.
Rudy Giuliani said, it's a Muslim ban. He called upon me to write it so that it would look like it's not a Muslim ban.
And just your point, again, that was done in the transition after the election.
Right.
But Bill, how appropriate is it? And this was a question that I had when the Ninth Circuit had the case before it. How appropriate is that to consider?
Oh, I think it's very appropriate because it calls it. He could.
I'm not saying it's inappropriate personally, but I was.
The Ninth Circuit was looking at the ban as it was written, but they also were taking into consideration because the states were urging it. The states were saying, "Look, forget what's written. This is what his real intent was. You don't have to believe us. This is what he said. Look at the videotape." And I don't think that there's anything he can do to eliminate that unless he comes out and says, "You know what? I was mistaken. That's not what this is about. I was wrong when I said it." That would be unconstitutional.
But it's not on the record. That's all I'm saying.
Before we run out of time, I did want to come back, Karin, to one point. We were telling me in the break. Two things. One, pay attention, I think, a big news story as it relates, coming back to our first conversation, which was as it relates to immigration and the deportations. The Dreamers, forget what you hear in the, at the press conferences. Don't worry, everything's fine. Read the fine print here, and it is subject to interpretation like so much of this. But the other point that you made to me, which I didn't know, was there are some legal remedies even for this population.
Absolutely. So I just say for anybody who thinks that they might be subject to enforcement, that they need to talk to a lawyer, an immigration lawyer, and figure out what their options are, because like I always say, you know, the term undocumented immigrant is there for a reason. It means that status is fluid. Undocumented people can become documented if only they talk to a lawyer and file an application.
And they do all the time.
And they do all the time. I do it every day.
Well, Karin, I really want to thank you for joining us. I know you had a very busy day, but you still made it on the program here, and you helped put a human face on this. Karin Anderson, thank you very much.
Sure.
You three guys stay with me. Coming up next, the administration, they're going to revoke some guidelines that protect transgender students. They say those issues should be handled in the states. States' rights here. And that's the big picture issue that I think, trust me, for the next few years is going to be a huge issue in this country. Well, we're going to talk about that and more after this.